Welcome back to the And I Hate podcast, a forum to discuss and combat student hate. Today, we have brought on Joy Ruppert, a junior at SDA who is active in many leadership roles, including ASB and SDA's Multicultural Anti-Racism Coalition. We are going to be discussing combating hate and leading the fight against hate in schools, as well as related local issues. Many podcasts have focused on students advocating for themselves outside of school, whether that's through a nonprofit or a club. For many students, it's easier to spark change when you are leading a club or an organization out of school. And here, Joy is here to give us that perspective. Okay, so I feel like I did not do you justice in that introduction. So go ahead and give us a quick background of yourself.
Hi, my name is Joy Ruppert. I'm a junior at San Diego Academy currently, and as what already kind of stated, I'm involved in a lot of extracurriculars, but all of my extracurriculars are mostly centered around social justice and social advocacy, and a lot to do with student voice. As stated prior, being kind of ASB president, Associative Student Body president, and past vice president, I get to kind of take all these very diversity, equity, and inclusion ideals and really utilize them in my school and figure out how can I create a more inclusive campus for my student body. And then I also get to utilize some of those ideas through my club and then also through just community programs in the area. So that's something super great.
Yeah, that's so cool. So can you elaborate more on your experience on ASB and the Multicultural Anti-Racism Coalition and how maybe they were similar and different?
Yeah, so I mean, we were being the co-founder of our school's first kind of multicultural club. That was definitely a big step and something that has never been done before. We don't have before this year, we never had an Asian student union or a Black student union or a Hispanic Latinx student union. So really this kind of coalition paved the way for those other student communities and groups to form, while also being a place for people who aren't students of color to also engage and advocate for inclusivity at our school. So that coalition is very much a safe place and a place to foster education in our school. As for ASB, that is a completely different environment. It is still very student leadership based. However, much like at a lot of other schools in our school district, it is very predominantly has a very white student population in my very own class. Like I'm the second student of color and Asian American in there, maybe only second Asian American, but it is still a complete shift in energy. But it's nice in it that since I'm the president, I can still push these ideas from my coalition into something that the rest of the student body can enjoy, while I can also educate kind of my class about intersectionality and the importance of learning about one another and kind of merge those two clubs and groups together.
Yeah, I think that influence is so important. And from my understanding of ASB, at my school personally, they work on a lot of like student outreach or student-based events. Has there been any opportunity to take the things that you're learning or you're working on in the Multicultural Anti-Racism Coalition and apply it to the things that you're working on in ASB?
Yeah, so that was one of the best things that this year, since coming into my presidency, I was really able to push out our first multicultural, was called the Cultural Heritage and Pride Festival at our school. So that was a day that was centered solely around marginalized communities. So we had our Gender Sexuality Alliance out there, we had Japanese Americans, we had Chinese Americans, we had our Jewish community out there, as well as a lot of other really great communities who came out to share their culture and share their foods and share their identity with the student body. One of my favorite comments about the event from a student and from our teachers was just how it felt like after a year of online school and disconnection, it felt like everyone was entering back into a safe space, into a home. And so many students were so honored to be able to have the chance to share part of themselves that normally you wouldn't just bring up in a daily conversation. It was an opportunity to celebrate one's culture while simultaneously kind of sharing that with other people. So through my ASB experience, we were really able to get that event started and going in the first place, especially since that was kind of the first multicultural and identity event that our school has ever had.
Yeah, that's really impressive. And I honestly think that bit about connection is so powerful. I'm sure it took so much planning and deliberation to get this event to actually happen. And I'm from what you're telling me, it had huge payoff. A lot of other schools don't have the first of all, the multicultural anti-racism coalition as a whole. Like you said, it's a new idea. And then second, this kind of overlap between those kinds of alliances and those kinds of safe spaces and ASB. So, what are other ways that students can access this forum to connect and to connect with one another, basically?
Yeah, I think the nice thing about being at my school site is that um, we really do have a need for connectivity. And I think a lot of people do, especially being online. So I say if you're a student of color, or if you even are not a student of color, really finding those affinity groups can really be a safe space, and it can really connect you to a community of people who share the same experience of you as you, or it can really connect you with people who have the same mindset and ideals. And I think that is the best way to go about it, especially if your school doesn't have a foundation like what we have at my school. So really just reaching out to those people and finding that community will go a long way.
Yeah, for sure. And the way that I see it with you, I think this is so important, is that you were a co-founder of the Multicultural Anti-Racism Coalition. So you kind of made that community for yourself. So do you think that having this kind of leadership or this kind of, yeah, having this kind of leadership role helps students find their own safe space? And would you encourage it for other students in like ASB or any kind of other school associations?
Exactly. I put it in that exact same way. I think at my school, being able to create that first safe space for students of color and for non-students of color to help was really that kind of was something completely new. And I think that's the thing with if for future leaders and future ASB members is, especially if you don't have enough people, let's say, because at my school we have a very small Asian American population, so not enough to necessarily start an Asian student union. But what I end up doing in my ASB class is making sure that the events we put on, we go and check and make sure that our LGBTQ plus students are informed about what this event is. They can give us feedback on things we might miss. Same with our Hispanic Latinx student union. Like, we always make sure that we're hearing from these communities to make sure all the events we put on are inclusive. So it's not, you don't need to have one event that focuses in all this inclusivity. Every event or any program that you're a part of should really have this goal and route of inclusivity. So for example, for Valentine's Day, we wrote every student's name on a heart. And we figured out through our input from our LGBTQ students, we ended up dead naming a lot of transgender students because we were going through Aries. And that was a mistake that we wouldn't have caught if we didn't try and reach out to that marginalized community or to that student group. So that's kind of what I would suggest for people who are in these positions but want to make sure that the events and the things that they're doing really have that goal and intention of being inclusive.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that like input and feedback, even if those students themselves aren't on ASB, is really, really important. And I know that for schools, there isn't really like a one size fits all policy. Like certain schools may be more or less receptive to doing certain things and accepting feedback and stuff like that. But in general, do you think there's any way that students can participate in these initiatives at their school, whether it's through like giving the feedback or even joining the groups that you're talking about, like ASB, stuff like that?
Yeah, I think one thing that's very cool is youth our age like our generation is very active and very strong and passionate. So I think once you find that community of people, or even like myself, create that community, you will be supported, whether it's through pushing out a policy or like an initiative that you want your principal to take on, or pushing out an event. Having that community and foundation to help you either plan the event or just be there for emotional and mental health support means a lot, and any student can really find these communities if you look or make it. It's really kind of it's all, you have a lot of control, and I think a lot of people listen to youth voice nowadays because it's very important.
Yeah, for sure. And I'd say that right now, like young people have so many different platforms, whether that's like in person, even like emailing their staff members, stuff like that. But I'd say one of Gen Z, I guess, their biggest platforms is social media. So would you say that social media is effective in like giving you guys this kind of feedback? And what are instances in which social media has helped you guys like avoid certain mistakes or make things more inclusive?
So I think social media has a lot to do with accessibility. So let's say students can't make it to our meetings, or some kids are still on online school. Especially during COVID, we ended up using YouTube and our Instagram as primary ways to get out educational videos. So one of the things that I ended up recording was a very simple toolkit about how to have an anti-racist mindset. And what we ended up doing with that is converting it into a video and uploading it onto YouTube so that middle school teachers in our school district could show that to their students, and then share that once we posted it on their social media. It was the easiest way for students to repost on their story and to get more information out. And whether that be our anti-racist video or like some of our public comments, like one thing that I'm very involved in, even outside of my school site, is just public comments to our school board in general. I make sure that whenever I get or hear students who are able to speak to the board, we try and record that and publish that onto our social media as well. So students can see that your voice matters and that you can be a part of the conversation, especially for those marginalized students who don't often get a seat at the table. Because of just our history and how our system has affected us. So social media has definitely, I think, helped us not only with feedback, but help us get important information out to community members who might need it.
Definitely. I think that's really important. And then just going back to your point about public comments, I think that it's definitely like a really good way to get messages out, especially since I guess I kind of speak from like my perception of this, but I think that a lot of the board meetings and stuff like that where public comments are made, they're watched by like adults largely, like parents, sometimes teachers, sometimes staff, stuff like that. And I think it's really important to have like the kids' perspective resonate with the adults and just be exposed to the adults. But what I've been finding with a lot of, especially like recent board meetings and stuff, is that the comments are made by adults. So how do you think kids are able to bypass a largely like adult space? And how can they empower themselves and others with like district level things like public comments?
I think that's the part where I'm still trying to negotiate in predominantly white or predominantly adult situations is something that we as youth, especially youth of color, are still trying to negotiate, and we'll always keep learning. So kind of what I found best is I went to one of the most recent board meetings to speak out about like certain like recent comments, but also the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion education. I was the only student there. And I was the only one to go up to that podium and speak my mind, which was extremely scary, especially because it was on live and people were recording. But I think the best way, and I mean, I didn't just start off like that. I've gone to board meetings for several years now, but I think the best way for students to start going to these meetings and start making those public comments is by going in a group, going with a student group who shares your ideals and shares your message, so that you guys can go on one speaker, one message, and then the next one, and then the next one. So it's not like you're going up there alone with this, what it feels like only youth opinion to have no one there to back you up. And then that means that more youth are entering in these conversations, because as you said, our board meetings are predominantly parents, but that is not necessarily who our school district serves. They serve the teachers and they serve students. So our voices should be the front of the line, but it's a scary situation. And the environment that is created now in our school district is so unsafe for students to really make those public comments right now. That's why it's safest and best to go, I think, in a group, so you have support and your voice is louder.
Definitely. And you talked about having like interest in these board meetings before. Obviously, your most recent comment was not your first, probably won't be your last. So where did your interest personally stem from? And how do you think we can get more students involved on like a district level, entering a predominantly adult white space so that they can start going in groups and making the student voice more heard?
Yeah, so I mean, first question is, I started going to these board meetings to originally petition for, back in 2020, petition for ethnic studies and diversifying our school curriculum. But because that was almost too much for our board to handle at the time, it ended up just being me with a group of other kids from Canyon Crest and LCC, just going on to these board meetings and constantly asking, can we have one can we have one literary book from a person of color in one of our English classrooms? Because there was so much pushback. So that's really what started my original going to the board and asking for these things. And then I think as for getting more students on board, like having those, as I said kind of before, in those clubs or in those safe spaces, bring up the conversation of, let's take the work that we do at our school and let's maybe bring that to a district-wide level. How can we maybe collaborate with a club on another school site? And how can we maybe at this next board meeting all fill up the public comments and let's go in together, one after one, pushing for this idea and pushing for this initiative that we stand very strongly for. And I think that's the best way to go about it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they listen. As you can see, I'm still doing all this stuff, but it feels good knowing that you're pushing for the stuff that you believe in and you're going to keep fighting for it with the people that you're with.
Definitely. I actually haven't been super involved with like the district-wide stuff or the board meetings, stuff like that, since I think last summer. And you talked about the group that was pushing for ethnic studies. In the past, has a group been successful in getting what they want in terms of like whether it's like specific courses, specific books, stuff like that? And was it students?
Yeah, I would say so. The group that I was working with last year, we were able to really push for at least getting some options for teachers to choose from in our classes. So I think that has definitely, that just us presenting, even if our district didn't take action, teachers watching saw that and decided to implement maybe one thing about this like group of people. Like in my English class this year, we decided to do kind of an essay centered around police brutality and its ties to like Rosa Parks, and we did an essay about that, and that was something I made sure to thank my teacher for. And she was like, I saw the board meetings and I saw the need. We also, at our school, we were able to start our very first ethnic literature class at our school. So that's the first ever ethnic studies like class that actually has gotten started in our school district. And the teacher who is running that now really contributes a lot of that start and a lot of that fuel to students like us who are petitioning for it, because a class won't run if there's not a need. And we were able to express that need enough to get that class started. So hopefully in the future, once this class ends, they're going to basically copy and paste this curriculum and send it over to Canyon Crest and then to LCC. So this is that was something super successful and exciting that we were able to accomplish this year.
Oh, wow. That's so exciting. So you talked about kind of a teacher that saw the board meetings and was able to like start the class and stuff like that. And I think that like the combination of student and teacher involvement is really important. Would you say that it would help to have more teachers represented in board meetings in terms of like public comments and more teachers involved in board meetings outside of public comments?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one thing that's so hard for the board members is there's so much parent and community feedback from people who
Mhm.
aren't necessarily the ones in these school sites, which is a issue in it of itself because they're not supposed to be necessarily serving the parents, and they're supposed to be listening to the teacher's voice and our voices because we're what makes the schools happen. We're the ones who foster these creative environments and inclusive environments. So definitely it would be great if more teachers could get involved in these board meetings because their voices matter a lot, because without them I wouldn't be here, many students wouldn't be here, and they shouldn't be worrying right now, if they teach this curriculum, what if I don't have a job next year? Or if I teach this
Mhm.
curriculum or tell this story about my personal life, what if a student decides to report that, or if a parent
Yeah.
overhears? That's the fear that's happening right now, and it's sad that that's the environment that has been accumulating. But
Mhm.
I think when students come out and voice their love and appreciation for teachers, that
Mhm.
respect and that kind of safety net will help protect their teachers more, and they'll be willing to go to more meetings and speak their minds. It's just so much fear right now, and there's a
Yeah.
lot trapping teachers from wanting to speak their mind.
Definitely. This idea, and it really sucks because teachers are so important and really honestly life-changing in most instances. And I've definitely noticed, like I picked up on what you're saying, like this kind of environment of fear. Where do you think it stems from? Whether it's at like a district level or even within individual schools? Like why are teachers afraid to teach what they feel is right?
I mean, that's the question that's circling across the nation right now. I mean,
Yeah.
talking about specifically because my experience is in ethnic studies and diversifying curriculum, so that's the only thing I can speak to. But when people really talk about one's own identity and the race and kind of the systems that have either been put in place that prevent them from getting either equal pay or equal access to healthcare and education systems, people get very nervous when
Mhm.
talking about privilege. And that's where it really roots down to. Parents don't want their kids to hear a story about slavery and then feel guilty about it when the lesson in and of itself isn't supposed to make anyone feel guilty. It's just supposed to educate and not
Yeah.
whitewash and erase this part of history. That's the main point of ethnic studies. It's supposed to humanize students, it's supposed to humanize individuals, but the fear is like making someone feel it's like a term called white fragility. So it's like that's
Mhm.
what teachers are so scared of getting called out for, especially like our ethnic studies, ethnic lit teacher. She is very, although has her own class, she's still cautious about
Yeah.
what she says, and that's just the climate of what the United States is in right now. So many people are just trying to humanize one another, but there's a lot of very fragile situations that and it's very uncomfortable to acknowledge one's own privilege, but it's necessary to get us forward and move our world into a better place for all.
Yeah, definitely. That is just such wow, that is just such like a I can't even find the words for this. Like that's just such a a- like it's kind of like a beautiful concept, not the idea of like white fragility, obviously, just the idea that like we need to humanize one another to the point where like only like to the point where not to the point where the white perspective isn't like the only one, you know. That took me a while to get out. Oh my goodness gracious. I feel kind of shallow following that entire explanation, that beautiful explanation with like this kind of question. But do you think, I think in a lot of districts, maybe it's just ours, but I think in a lot of like school districts and a lot of educational settings, there's a lot of parent involvement, obviously, because they care about their kids. And I think that at some point it becomes overwhelming to the point where they're kind of speaking over students, speaking over teachers. Do you think that's happening in our district? And do you think it's like causing harm to the kids?
Yeah, I definitely think that's the situation. I mean, you said we go to these board meetings, and
Mhm.
it's supposed to be like, even just like the speak talking about homeroom, parents are involved in the
Yeah.
conversation, and it's like teachers are the ones who and students are the ones who are going to be directly affected by this.
Mhm.
And it's although parent voice is important, it shouldn't be the only determining factor for stuff that students need and what teachers need. So like on our scale currently right now is so many parents are scared of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but
Yeah.
it's mostly just due to a lack of education. It's people don't understand that learning about diverse stories and learning about a single Asian American author or reading a book by an African American woman is not going to indoctrinate your kid. It's just going to teach them another perspective, and it's going to teach them about the contributions that people of color have had on our nation. It's not supposed to target anyone. It's not supposed to make anyone feel guilty. It's just, as we kind of stated, trying to make sure that everyone understands each other's backgrounds, intersectionalities, and humanizing at the end of the day. So I think it's definitely, I think a lot of students understand this concept, and teachers do as well, because we're in these environments that foster
Mhm.
this environment of inclusion. But because parents aren't in that environment, their opinions are not the same as ours, and they do overshadow a lot of the voices that should be listened to.
Oh yeah, for sure. I feel like as I grew up, I was really taken by surprise when I found out that honestly, adults are more bigoted than like their kids and stuff like that. Because like I always just grew up with this perception that adults would be generally more mature, more accepting, more receptive to like new ideas or unfamiliar ideas. And that was something that I really wasn't met with as I grew up more and more. Do you think there's like any way to counter this? Obviously, it's not one size fits all. But is there any way to like increase education to those who are maybe ignorant or just generally hateful about these issues?
Yeah, I think the important thing is getting into those uncomfortable conversations. For
Mhm.
example, on our district right now, we had a lot of Asian American families all of a sudden get fed this narrative that, oh, diversity, equity, and inclusion work should not be put into the
Yeah.
classroom because of this comment that just happened in a DEI meeting, which
Mhm.
is not the case at all. So what ended up happening is one of our community members, and I watched it happen, she simply went over to these families, said, I share your experience and I share your hurt from this comment and from comments like this that are insolent and happen on the daily. But we need to understand that in order to prevent racist comments or racist intended like biases from entering, in order to stop these comments from happening, we need education, and we need to teach students in the classroom when they're still learning and developing as their own individuals, that you, even though you may not look the same as this person or talk the same or come from the same background, you guys will share a common interest. And I think that's the best way, is just finding a middle ground and connecting as individuals first, and then carrying out a conversation about why this is needed and why it will help you and why it will help your kid. um, Specifically talking, if you're talking to adults or parents, but I think that's the best way to go.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think when kids are growing up, they're definitely more receptive to like new, unfamiliar familiar ideas. And it's honestly parents, a lot of, well, not all parents, obviously, but a lot of parents that are against ethnic studies and anything resembling it have this really, number one, outdated idea of what ethnic studies is. And it's just generally like warped. Like you said earlier, they view it as indoctrination. Do you think that teaching like students in schools about ethnic studies, about like different backgrounds, stuff like that, and then having them go home to their parents, tell them about the stuff that they learned and introduce this new perspective through like a different lens, as a generalization, do you think that would overall like decrease hate at an adult level, or do you think they're generally just not receptive to those ideas?
I think that will definitely decrease hate and increase adaptability for, because I mean,
Yeah.
as you get older, we learn about this all the time, you get stuck in your ways or stuck in your ideologies. But having your kid or having a younger like youth come and just speak to you about what they learned and how basically how acknowledging that their mindset isn't necessarily wrong, but here's another way and here's another story and here's another perspective to look at. For example, like, I mean, in environmental science, let's say we don't, my parents are like, oh, there's just smog in these certain areas because they're just underdeveloped. And then I come home and say, oh, well, they're underdeveloped and there is smog in these areas, but let's look in deeper and let's look at the communities who are living there. They're mostly African American or Latino, Latinx, and that's important to understand, and how that ties to like redlining and just the socioeconomic income gap. And that is basically just taking their beliefs and just showing it at another perspective. And I think that, especially coming from a youth and one's own kid, will help decrease hate and increase adaptability and acceptance.
For sure. I think the increase of adaptability and acceptance is really, really important, especially honestly, like both at the level that you were talking about earlier, like the district level within schools, stuff like that, but also in like people's own homes, because parents who have older beliefs or maybe outdated beliefs, like aren't fully informed, they're gonna be pretty receptive to their kid telling them like specifics about it. Overall, like besides classes at school, ethnic studies, stuff like that, what are resources for students to learn more about like outdated beliefs, different backgrounds, stuff like that?
So, I mean, there's always, outside of school and outside of like the classroom and at home, I mean, I think the power of self-education is so cool, because I mean, before sophomore year, I didn't know that I was considered a person of color. Like, I genuinely have been surrounded by such a predominantly white community that I wasn't equipped with the terms that I'm saying now. I wasn't equipped with like, oh, what I experienced back in like middle school, elementary school was kind of racist and not that fun. And I think literally, it's great because Barnes and Nobles and bookstores actually have sections that contain books that are so educational and equip students with the terminology and students of color needed to validate one's own experience. So it's like one book that I picked up was Brown Scars, White Tears, and it talks about how white feminism harms women of color. And that just explains why, well, if you're like a woman of color and you're in a feminist club and you might feel a little excluded or feel a little out of place, or you have these experiences that don't relate to the white students or white women who are in those clubs, that is what that is. And that was something I did my own self-research on, and finding books online and honestly Google searches. That's what a lot of students did over quarantine when the Black Lives Matter movement broke out. A lot of people just took to social media, took to the internet to find resources and community groups who are advocating and educating themselves. So, I mean, it sounds a little fun, silly to just be like, oh, look it online, or oh, go to the bookstore. It truly is the best way. And the way that I am who I am today is just by, on my own time, sitting and just learning and educating myself and having conversations with my friends that are uncomfortable but necessary, and learning from different perspectives.
Yeah, definitely. You are obviously very passionate and informed about all of these issues, and it served you well, like in your leadership positions, being able to be inclusive and stuff like that. Would you say that this kind of knowledge, passion, information about all of these important subjects is a prerequisite for being like an inclusive leader or inclusive in a leadership role?
Yes, definitely. I think, not to toot my own horn, but I think everything that I've learned up to now has helped me become a better leader, but then also just a better person in general.
Yeah.
I think learning to understand that um, everyone is going through their own things, everyone has their own different backgrounds and stories has helped me come into discussions and conversations, whether it's be deciding an event or deciding whether or not to get rid of homeroom or not. It has helped me as a leader come into conversations with open ears and an open mind, and has also taught me to kind of use my voice as a leader to be like, hey, you've talked a lot, let's pass it over to these students or this group of youth who haven't spoken a lot during this meeting, or
Mhm.
pass it over to this person who has ideas but keep getting spoken over. And it's using that and using my leadership and voice to really advocate for those communities is something that I'm very thankful I was able to develop before getting into a lot of these things that I'm involved in today.
Definitely. Thank you so much for, well, first of all, that's a really powerful message, using your voice to advocate for others and just being in these leadership positions in the first place. Thank you so much for all of the work that you've done at your own school, on the district level, and for being here in the first place. It was really, really informative, and this was such a great time. So thank you so much.